Amen. At the end of our last presentation, I introduced the idea that the first and second angel messages have time attached to them, and that the third message is a singular point or a singular event in history. And you can see that brought to view in the parable of the 10 virgins, where this is the shut door that gets shut suddenly at the end. In the story of Noah, you can see again this gradual development, or this test. Again, the door is shut suddenly at the very end. When we draw a reform line, as we've done here, there's something that I want to explain about this that sometimes isn't so obvious. So here are these 3 steps, 1, 2, 3. And this is where the test begins. This is probationary time. And from now on, I'm going to be marking this as the empowerment of the first message, as Brother Patrick explained in his earlier presentation. So I'm not going to be dealing, unless it's just the odd time, with the time of the end. Here's the time of the end. And I'm not going to be focusing my attention here, it's just this first, second and third step that we're looking at. When we talk about the first step and then the second and the third, and we introduce probationary time into these stories, what I want us to begin to become familiar with, and many of us are not, is that this is a story of the construction of a temple or a building that we've already discussed. And when we think about this building that's being built, here's our building, it's a church, that this is built of individual stones. We introduced this concept. This is directly from Paul's writings, and each one of those stones is symbolised or represented by people. So when we think about this line here, this history, beginning from the empowerment of the first to the close of probation at the end, we're thinking about this group of people that are all going through these 3 steps. And they're all going to go through these 3 steps, and they're going to be controlled by these waymarks, which are historical events. These are things that you can read about in newspapers. These are things that are going to be easy to identify. This is what we are bringing to view when we think of these reform lines. Now, on top of that, each and every one of us, we also have to have a relationship or interact with God on a personal level. Now, you and I will understand that. We need to go to Christ, we need to repent of our sins, we need to be converted, we need to have justification, we need to live a sanctified life. And then if we get laid to rest at any moment in our life, it could happen this afternoon, tomorrow, who knows what could happen to us, then our probation would close when we die, and then when our names are called up in the judgment, our book is opened and the decision's made upon whether or not we're going to have eternal life or we're going to have eternal death. So that's pretty standard Adventist teaching, we're all familiar with that. So when we think about this concept here of these lines, I want us to be clear that we're not dealing with individual people, we're dealing with a movement or a church that's being addressed here. But what we have to do is we have to realise that the church is built up of all of these people, all of these stones, and we have to conceptualise and have two models in our hand. One of them is this model of a church, and the other one is a model of individual people in that church and how they interact with this reform line. How do they fit into the picture of this? And as we go through the studies this weekend, we're going to juggle these two concepts about your individual personal walk with God, that you need to have dealt with sin, you need to be a righteous person because judgment's about to happen, or you need to be fearing God, you should be scared because He's identifying you as a sinner, you need to glorify His name because you're going to be judged, or you need to be justified because you recognise that there's sin in your life. Once you're just, you need to be living a sanctified life, and eventually you'll be glorified. So these are concepts that are all these are all parallel or synonymous terms, one with another. These three groups, and they're all attached to the first, second, and third angels' messages. And when we think about justification, sanctification, and glorification, especially these two here, justification, sanctification, we often think of them on a personal level. But when we take this personal walk that we have with God, that we're justified and sanctified, we have to integrate those ideas into this reform line or this reform movement. Because this reform movement is as I said, dealing with a church or the building of a church, whilst these concepts are normally only dealt with on an individual basis. So we have these two concepts and we have to merge them together. And sometimes we don't have clarity on how you do that. And as we go through this weekend, hopefully it will become clearer. So what I've shown you is that this testing time or probationary time, first you have the history of the first angel's message, then the second, and then eventually the third. Now this message has been taught for a long time now, maybe 20 years, well over a decade. We've understood many of these truths, and one of the things that we've consistently taught is the following, is that there is time attached to the first and second tests, but when you come to the third, it becomes a singular event. Now, if you just conceptualize looking at a distant object with your naked eye, often you'll see this thing as just a singular object here. But if you had a pair of binoculars or a telescope and you looked at that object in more detail, you can begin to see often that it contains much more information than you can see with your naked eye. Or if you're driving along in a car and you see a distant object, the closer you get to that object, the more information or the more details you see about it. Now, as we've progressed and moved closer and closer to this third waymark, and we have in this message, I mean literally as we've gone through the years, we're getting closer and closer to this event here, we've begun to discover things about this event. And one of the things that we've seen is that contrary to our original understanding, where we would say that this was just a singular point in history, a singular event, that there are actually a cluster of events that are associated with this third angel. So what I'm going to try and do to portray that is to show you that this third angel, let me begin by doing it this way. Here's my singular event, and as I'm getting closer to it, I actually see that it's two events that are very close to one another. And if you looked at them from a distance, they would actually only look like a singular line. Not like these ones, which are so far apart that you can distinguish between them. So these are so far apart you can distinguish, and these are as well. You know that this is the second angel's history. But when it comes to the third, these two events are so close together that from a distance, it looks like they're just a singular line as shown here. But as you get closer and you zoom into it, you actually see that there are two events. Now I'm just simplifying it by saying that there's two events, because there is still more detail in this history which we're not going to really be addressing in our presentations this weekend. We're just beginning to introduce the idea that the third step, instead of being this singular event, actually has some time period attached to it. Even though it's relatively short, it still has these two waymarks. So as we develop our line, we're going to see that we have the first, second, and we're going to have the third. And I'm going to put the third in here. I'll do it that way. Just to clearly show you that the third message is contained between these two tightly connected waymarks together here. And here's the first, and here's the second, like this. So hopefully that's relatively straightforward for you to see and conceptualize. Originally, as I said, we used to teach this was just a singular point, but as we're getting closer and closer to this event, we're beginning to see that there's some history in here, even though they're tightly, it's only a short amount of time relatively speaking, but yet we can see these two waymarks. Now the other thing that I want us to begin to grapple with and deal with, and Brother Patrick's going to develop this idea as he goes through his presentations, that when you look at Millerite history, so here's Millerite history, 1798 to 1844, and here's the first and the second and the third message, that this is a simplification of what's going on in this history. And when we bring this history into our own history, what we see is that these messages, these two messages, the first and the second, they actually become combined at the end of the world in a fashion that looks like this. And so we have the first and we have the second. And so here I'm showing you the first and the second angel's messages, and here's the third. The third just drops straight down. Here's the third. So we have the first and the second message in our history like this. And as I said, I'm showing that the third message has got some history attached to it, so I'm putting the third like this. The second runs to the end here. Here's the third, looking like this. So this is the line, or the reform line, that we're going to be dealing with in my presentations from here on forward. It's going to look like this. That we're going to see the first and second messages are occurring at the same time, and then you have the second angel running through history until it meets the third. We're checking what day we're on. We're on Friday today, and by the time we get to probably halfway into tomorrow, or maybe late tomorrow, Brother Patrick will have laid out enough information for me to explain some of the things, or some of the reasoning why I've drawn the line in this way. So he's going to, by the time he'll have caught up by that to me, I'll be able to explain some of the reasoning behind this if it hasn't made much sense. For instance, this combining work will be explained, and how we're developing this line in the way that I've done it. So at the moment, if you can just work with me to, I guess, accept that the line that I want us to consider looks like this. The first, second running through history until it meets the third, and the third having some history itself attached to this short period of time here. So that's the reform line that we're going to be considering. And as I say, by late tomorrow, hopefully, I should be able to explain how this works when you've received some more information from him. So if all of that has made sense, good. If it hasn't made sense, I'm sorry, but it is really difficult to lay two pieces of information and try and run them parallel to one another. It's difficult to do that, and there's a lot of information that's buried behind just drawing a simple line like this. Normally it takes many, many hours of study, and I think Brother Patrick mentioned this, that this weekend is just really an introduction for you to become familiar with some of the principles and concepts of how reform lines are put together, and in my studies, how this work of the third angel is going to be considered at the end of the world. Even if you're familiar with reform lines, there's still a lot of information that many of us are not clear upon, and hopefully some of those things should be made clearer this weekend for you, for those of you who are slightly more advanced than the others. So if this looks a bit strange, hopefully you can work with me on this issue. So the first thing I want to do is introduce a phrase to you. It's on page 2. Let me think. Actually, if you go to page 1, it's the title of our weekend, our subject. It says the third angel's message and the binding of. That's the title of my messages. The third angel's message and the binding of. And what I'm going to show you is that the third angel's message is the binding of. And I'm going to shorten binding of just to BO, binding of. And we're going to define what this all is about. And the first couple of pages are going to help to define what the binding of is, what the work of the third angel is, and what it means to each and every one of us. So the first thing we want to do is just work with a dictionary definition of what binding off means. And so really, when you bind off something, it just simply means a conclusion. If you look in a dictionary, that's really a general, simple definition of what the binding off means. It means the conclusion of something, or another way of expressing that is a summary. So that really is what I want us to go away with after this weekend, to know that this term binding off, all it really means, it means the conclusion of a matter, the conclusion of a message, the conclusion of a subject, or another way of expressing that is a summary. It's a summarization of a message. That's what the binding off means. Now this word binding off is not something, again, that man has invented. This is an inspired statement. We're going to read it in the Spirit of Prophecy. She uses this word binding off. It's found in the scriptures, although it doesn't say binding off. It uses words like bound off or bind them. But it's a biblical term, and it's also a term that Spirit of Prophecy uses. So the binding off is a conclusion or a summary. We're going to read in a minute that this conclusion or a summary is how Ellen White explains what the binding off is. Now, all of us have been to school, and when you were at school, you were taught how to write papers or essays. I'm not sure what you call them here. We call them essays back from where I am. If you had to write a story or a report of some kind. And all reports follow the same structure. Wherever you go in the world, it's always the same way of doing it. So the first thing you do is you have an introduction, then you have the main body, and then you have the conclusion. I'm pretty sure that's how you were taught to write stories. Another way of expressing it is tell them what you're going to say it, and repeat what you've already said. Yeah, this is the standard way of writing stories. Everybody in the world is taught this way to do it. And it shouldn't come as a surprise that it's in 3 steps. You'll see these 3 steps is embedded in the psyche of a human being. You know, we were created in the image of God, and He's created patterns and sequences and the way that we operate and the way we do things in really well-defined patterns. And one of them is these 3 steps. Now, if you were to do a course on public speaking, now you can go to evening class and do a course in public speaking. One of the things that they will teach you is that when you make points, never make more than 3 points, because people cannot juggle more than 3 points in their minds at any one time. If you introduce 4 points in a narrative, people will drop one of them or lose them. And it's an art of public speaking. It's well recognised, but people don't realise the whys and wherefores of it. This is just brain science. People have come to the conclusion of, but it's all embedded in this principle that God created us in His image, and this number 3 is the everlasting gospel, this message that saves people. So here it is. We have our story to do, and we've got the introduction, then the main body, then the conclusion. Tell them what you're going to say it, and then repeat what you're going to say. And that's why we call it a summary. So a summary is a succinct repetition of what you've already said. So we agree with that? This is just common sense. So if this was true, then I could put a line here like this. So now this is going to come into maths. Now we're going to introduce some maths into this. And so now I want to do this. The introduction plus the body is the conclusion, because the conclusion is just a summary of what you've already said. So everything that you've said at the beginning in these 2 steps, that's what the conclusion is, just to repeat and enlarge, or repetition and enlargement. And so now we're using biblical terminology or religious terminology that you're familiar with. Repeat and enlargement. Now if we think of this as the everlasting gospel, here's the 1st, 2nd and 3rd step. What I want to introduce to you is this idea that when we think about the 3rd step, that it's just a summary or a conclusion of the initial 1st steps. So here we have the 1st and the 2nd, and you'll see that the 1st and 2nd steps are always connected together. That's one of the reasons why I'm showing them connected here. There are connected steps that you can't separate. And when we think about justification, sanctification, glorification, you'll see really this is a true state of affairs. I'm not sure how much of a working knowledge we have about justification and sanctification, but these 2 things happen at the same time. When a person is justified, you cannot disconnect that to a sanctified experience. Sanctification and justification are connected. They're not the same thing. There's slight differences between them, and we're not going to go into any detail about them this weekend, but I'm just going to touch on the slight differences between them. But one thing I want us to feel comfortable with or accept, that justification without sanctification will not get you anywhere. And you cannot be sanctified without first being justified. There's a sequence that they have to happen. You first have to be justified and sanctified. And if you were just justified, then really there's no way you're going to get into heaven. Ellen White describes it in this way. She says, justification is your certificate or your title to get into heaven. But sanctification is your fitness or your ability or your right to be there. So here you have your title and here you have your fitness. Now the way justification is taught in the church today, or sanctification for that matter, they're not taught correctly. And so we have this skewed concept of the everlasting gospel and how justification and sanctification work. And one of the works or the mission of Wagner and Jones was to set this issue or this subject straight of how justification and sanctification work. That was the core component of their ministry, which was rejected by the church. And that rejection has only hardened and got worse over the years. So here we have the first and the second messages. You can call it justification, sanctification if you like, but these two are connected together. And I'm saying this, the first and the second is the third message. The third message is a repetition or a summary of the first and second messages. And as we read these statements from this 1909 General Conference and the committee meetings that Ellen White attended after that conference, she's going to make plain that this is so. So I'm addressing it first. I'm telling you what you're going to read, what we're going to see, and then we just want to verify that that's what the Spirit of Prophecy teaches. So the second thing we want to see as we read these statements is that this, she's going to identify as a singular message. So at one moment she's going to call it a singular message, and she'll call it the message. Now, we're all English speaking here, and we know that the word the is the definite article, and when we say the message, it's talking about something that's identifiable, that you can pinpoint, and it's individual. It's a focused, our attention's focused on this single thing, the message, one. So she calls this the message, and she's going to say that the third is a repeat. And what's another word for repeat? It's a summary or a conclusion, because that's how we do our stories, remember? This is a repeat of what? Of the message. When you begin to understand this concept about the relationship of these three messages, the 1, 2 and 3, a lot of the information, if you read Wagner and Jones's material, begins to make sense without understanding the relationship of these three steps, because Wagner and Jones don't really address these three steps, the everlasting gospel, in the way or in the language that we use. They use Victorian language, they use Victorian imagery, and to be frank and honest, we live in the 21st century, and we don't have the mindset of Victorian Americans. Often when we read their writings, I don't think we have a full grasp of exactly what they're saying. It's to a degree a foreign language. So when this message has come to God's people today, it's been revamped, and the language that we're using is appropriate to the 21st century. But the concepts, the principles and the ideas are identical to the ones that Wagner and Jones were bringing forth to the church. It's the same message. Now, is there new light? For sure. Is there a development of truth? Of course there is. But essentially it's the same principle and the same ideas. But what confuses people is that when we draw out these lines, when we make these conclusions, they go back and read the writings of Wagner and Jones and they say, we can't see it in their writings. It's because the language that they use and the way they construct their logic is different to ours. But as you begin to be more and more comfortable with this type of understanding, then if you went back to read their material, or Ellen White's material, where she comments and bounces off their thoughts and ideas, you'll begin to see that we teach the same principle and the same ideas. You know, one of the things people don't realise, especially if you take the works of Jones, that if this was a bookshelf with all of A.T. Jones' material on it, that's everything he ever published in book form or in the magazine articles, this isn't to scale, but this would all be prophecy. And this is what we might call righteousness by faith, or the experience that everybody is so desirous of having or reading their materials about. He focused a large part of his ministry on prophecy, on the events that were occurring in the world at that time. He dealt with chronology, he dealt with many, many things. He has a book that's about 1.5 inches thick that is all talking about Babylon in the past and comparing it to Babylon in the present, which has got really nothing to do with the whole story of righteousness by faith. So people misunderstand his whole ministry. So what I'm saying is that even though we're using different language, once you become familiar, and it's much easier to understand what we teach because we're using language that all of us are familiar with, you go back and read his works, not just his subjects on righteousness by faith, but also on prophecy, you'll begin to see that what he teaches is the same as what we teach. So, introduction, body and conclusion. The conclusion is a summary of what you've already said, and this is the definition, a dictionary definition of the term binding off. And we're going to see that Ellen White is going to define the binding off of the third angel's message. So the third angel's message is the conclusion or the summary of something that's gone before it. And what's gone before the third is the first and second. And the first and second are a singular message, and the third is just a repetition of that message. So having said that, let's now read through some of these Spirit of Prophecy quotes to verify what we've just said. We're on page 2, and the subtitle is The Binding Off, a Definition. The first few boxes actually aren't really Spirit of Prophecy quotes. They just give you some background information. So I'm not going to read all of them. I'm just going to paraphrase each one. So we're in Life Sketches, page 422, paragraph 2 and 3. And it reads, after the 1909 General Conference, Ellen White, on her way back, met with the General Conference Committee and had a series of studies or meetings with them. And when she was having these meetings, this is what happens. It says, in her interviews with the General Conference Committee, Mrs. White read manuscripts dealing with some of the problems that were perplexing the brethren. The call to do a much larger work in the cities. There were two things she's going to deal with at this General Conference. One of them is the health work, and the other one is addressing the issue of going into the cities and doing a work there. The reason why she's dealing with these two issues is because she's having these struggles in the church. One of them is to do with the daily. There's a struggle in the daily between the leadership, and she wants to contain this open wound that's happening at the leadership, at the very highest levels of the church. And the way she's going to address it is to turn people's focus away from this infighting and to be focused on spreading the gospel message. And the other thing that she wants to address in the church is the rising power of the medical work that's occurring in the church. Kellogg is trying to essentially take over the church, and what his plans are is not that the health work becomes or remains as the right arm of the everlasting gospel, but he wants to turn it the other way around and see that the church is basically the tool that helps support the health work. And what he really wants to do is use the financing resources of the church to continue to prop up the health work that he wants to push forward. So these are the two issues that Ellen White's dealing with. But we're not going to be dealing with the health work. We're dealing with this issue about her call to turn away from this fighting and focus upon the mission of the gospel. We're in our second box. This is from the General Conference Bulletin, May 31st, 1909, paragraph 15. Let us take into consideration the work that is to be done in binding off this, the closing work of the message for these last days. May God help us to come near to him and follow him so closely that we shall know his goings forth are prepared as the morning. So in bold we've got, let us take into consideration the work that is to be done in binding of this, the closing work of the message for these last days. What she is saying is this: from the very beginning of the great controversy, 6,000 years ago, here's Adam, and here's the everlasting gospel. And this gospel message has been going all the way through. She calls it the message. This is the message. And at the very end, you come to the conclusion. So the conclusion of the message. That's why Brother Patrick read to you a statement yesterday that said this message at the end of the world is the same gospel that was given or delivered in Genesis 3:15 at the beginning. Because Ellen White is saying here there's this message that's run through history, and she says now at the end of the world we come to the conclusion of the message, and the message is this message here of Genesis 3:15. They're the same message. All you're doing is coming to the conclusion or the end of it, which is a summary or a repetition of that message. So she skipped 6,000 years of history, all those little intricate pieces of prophecy. She's put them all together and says this singular message, we're now at the end of the world where it's all going to come to the conclusion. And she says the closing work of this message, the conclusion or the closing work, she defines it this way: let us take into consideration the work that is to be done in binding off this, the closing work. So this closing work she defines as the binding off the message, coming and bringing it to a conclusion. Now, if that's the case, and it is, we know that there are many, many discrete histories. There's one here, there would be a break, there's one, another break. This is this picture that I drew for you before. Here are all these individual discrete reform lines. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, etc. When you come to this history here, and if we open this up a bit here and say this was this reform movement, and we had the first and the second and the third, what she's saying is that now we've come to the conclusion of the messages that have already been delivered already. So you can see this in two ways, but the primary definition, the way she's written it in this passage, is that she says the message, and now it is the closing or the binding off message. We've come to the very last moment of Earth's history. So that's our definition of the binding off. It's the closing work, and the closing work is a conclusion. These two are from dictionaries. These are dictionary definition, and this is from the Spirit of Prophecy. So these are dictionary definitions of the Spirit of Prophecy. It's the closing work or the finishing work. We're reading now Review and Herald, November 25th, 1909, paragraphs 1 to 3. Now, this Review and Herald article, it tells you quite clearly, it says, Friday morning, June the 11th, Mrs. White closed her work in Washington and in the afternoon went to Philadelphia to spend the Sabbath, where she was accompanied by Miss Sarah McIntyre. Now, we know that the General Conference was in May. We read it there, it says May 31st, General Conference Bulletin. Once the conference had finished, then she moves away and she goes on her way home, and she's going to do a series of meetings. That's what's being brought to view in this Review and Herald article. At the meeting with conference presidents and members of the General Conference Committee held in the seminary building Friday morning, Mrs. White made another earnest appeal in behalf of the work to be done in the large cities. So here she's talking about trying to distract the fighting that's going on so that the Lord's people would do the work that they were instructed to do. So let's read this statement quite carefully. In many of our large cities, the first and second angels' messages were proclaimed during the 1844 movement. So let's rub this out. And what she's just told us is the following. She says in the 1844 movement, which is 1798 to 1844, that's the movement that she's referring to. She says that the first and the second angel's messages were proclaimed to those cities. So here she says the first and the second messages were proclaimed in this history to the cities. Then she says, to you, as God's servants, has been entrusted the third angel's message. So we'll run through history, there's a break, and we're now here in 1909. 1909 is still the same time period as the 1888 period. It's still contained within that history. And she says, here, now you're supposed to be doing the work of the third angel's message. What she's saying is this, which is what we mentioned yesterday. Here's the third angel's message. It arrived in 1844. It's running through history. And in 1888, this angel of Revelation 18 came down and began to empower the third angel. Here it is coming down, and there's a confluence of this angel and this angel meeting. And this is where the third angel was going to be fulfilled perfectly or be empowered. And that's what she's referring to here. She says, to you as God's servants have been entrusted the third angel's message. To the Millerites we were entrusted the first and second messages. And to God's people in this period had been entrusted the third message. But she says this, the third angel's message, the binding off message. So here's our definition. The third angel's message is the binding off. That's what I defined it as, and this is what Ellen White says. We're in agreement with Ellen White. It says that this third angel's message, which is the binding off message, that is to prepare a people for the coming of our King. Everyone in Adventism agrees that the third angel's message is what is going to prepare God's people to meet Christ at his second coming. Everybody agrees with that. But the disagreement is on what the message of the third angel is, what it looks like, how it works, how you're supposed to prepare it, how you prepare for it, how you're supposed to teach it. So that's where the difference is on the details of the third angel. Everybody agrees the necessity of understanding it in order to prepare. That's why anybody who's interested in preparing for the second advent focuses on the third angel's message. Because it says here it's to prepare a people for the coming of our King. Page 3. Testimonies to the Church, Volume 9, page 98 to page 100. The title of this section is In the Cities of the East. Instruction has been given me that the message should go again with power in the cities in the eastern states. So she says here, instruction has been given by God, obviously, that the message, I didn't highlight that, but maybe you want to highlight that in your notes. It said the message, the definite article, singular, one message. Now we've got to tie this passage with the one that we just read, because it says in that first passage on page 2, in many of our large cities, the first and second angels' messages, plural, first and second angels' messages were given in the cities. She says that. Now this one, it says, instruction has been given me that the message, singular, should go again with powers in the cities in the eastern states. Now, these eastern states are the same cities that are mentioned in the Review and Herald article on the page before, when it says, in many of our large cities, these are the cities in the eastern seaboard, in the eastern states. So in 9 testimonies, she now calls the first and second angel's messages a singular message, not 2 messages individual. They're a combined singular message. Hopefully we can see that. It's important for us to understand the connection between these 2 concepts, that they're 2 messages, but they're also considered a singular message. In many of the large cities of the East, the first and second angel's messages were proclaimed during the 1844 period. Now, this is almost a word-for-word statement or repeat of what we just read on the page before. So here, we know when she says, instruction has been given me that the message, the singular message that we've just identified here, is the first and second angel's messages. We can do that just by proof texting these 2 sentences together. So what she says is this, that there was the message here in Millerite history, and the message was the first and second angels, and it went to all of these major cities in the East. Then she says, following this, to us as God's servants has been entrusted the third angel's message, the binding of message, virtual repeat of what we just read. But then she says this, that is to prepare a people for the coming of the King, which is all fine. Now, I want to skip a few words, and we want to pick up from the next paragraph, 82, paragraph 2, and just the bit that's highlighted. It says, repeat the message, repeat the message. So, here we see, you've got it here, repeat of the message. Repeat of the message must be the third message that's going to be dealt with, because she's spoken about the third angel's message has been entrusted to us. So here was the message, which was number 1 and number 2. Then she says that was them, and she says this is us, and to us has been given the third message, whereas they had the first and second messages. Hopefully we can see that. And then she says, repeat the message. So the message that's to be repeated is the message that's given here, the first and second. So when we come to the third angel's message and it says repeat, one of the things that you need to have a firm understanding of is that when you repeat the message, which is the third, it's actually a repeat of the first and second messages. So when you come to the third angel's message, if you see people are not introducing the concept or the idea that you need to incorporate the first and second angel's messages into the third message, you know they don't have a correct understanding of what the third angel's message looks like and how it should be repeated or given to God's people. She says, repeat the message, repeat the message. Now, why would she say that twice? What would be the reason for that? So I just want to digress for a moment, and I want to just bring a point of observation to you. Yesterday we spoke about Lewis Weir. If you remember, Lewis Weir was living in around the 1950s, and he studied Millerite William Miller's Rules of Prophetic Interpretation, and he had developed and refined them and added or introduced some of his own rules. Now, there are some rules that we have that we use today that we have gleaned from William Miller, from Lewis Weir, that we've refined, and we speak about or define, or we have a language that is all our own. We don't copy their language. And one of them is this repetition. Now, if you go into the scriptures, you're going to find it runs into, the 20s, maybe 30, maybe up to around 50 verses that I think I've seen that has this repetition, and it happens in so many different places. You see a statement or a singular word doubled. Now, why is this doubling occurring? Obviously, the Lord, He wants to teach us something by showing us this doubling. Now, the place that you really can see it absolutely clearly in two Bible passages, which are both found in the book of Revelation. It's Revelation chapter 14, verse 8, and Revelation chapter 18, verse 2. Now, both of these are Bible verses that you're all familiar with. This is the second angel's message. So these two verses are all dealing with the second angel's message. We should all be familiar with that. And what we see in these two verses is the phrase that says, Babylon is fallen, is fallen. So here we see this doubling. Remember we spoke about proof texting yesterday evening? When we deal with proof texting, and I gave the example of the Sabbath, but then I said, let's look at proof texting in the same way, but in a more refined way, and we looked at the Comforter. Remember we looked at the Comforter yesterday? This was John chapter 16, verse 8, and we saw that Christ is the Comforter, and we saw that the Holy Spirit is also the Comforter. And then we saw that the work of the Holy Spirit is 3 steps. 1, 2, 3. Sin, righteousness and judgment. And if the Comforter takes you through 3 steps, then any Comforter would have to take you to 3 steps as well. That's what proof texting does for you. Proof texting gives you the ability to see if you have the same connecting word and one word is going to be doing this thing, then when you see the same word somewhere else, it will be doing the same thing as well. So here we have 1, 2, 3. That means Christ has 3 steps as well as the Holy Spirit. So we're going to use the same methodology here. We're going to see that when you have the second angel's message, something that's unique about the second angel's message is that it has this doubling effect. We see that in verse 8 of chapter 14. So here we see a double, and here we see a double. And both of these are connected to the second angel's message. So here's a biblical principle that I want to share with you, if you're not familiar with it, is that anywhere, we'll begin with these ones. In Revelation 14 and Revelation 18, when you're dealing with the second angel's message, a characteristic of that message is that you will see a statement that is repeated. It's doubled. And in this case it says, is fallen, is fallen. Now, not only is it doubled in the verse, you actually have 2 verses that do it. So there's a doubling of the verses, and it's also doubled within the verse. So there's 2 doubles. It's a doubling of a doubling. If that makes, I don't know if that's correct English, but there's this doubling in each of the verse, and the whole principle is doubled. So there's the biblical principle that we teach that says the following. If you can see this here, then go to a story, and this is story X in the Old Testament. And in story X, someone said to someone, run away. Run away. Now, as soon as you read that story, and this story has got nothing to do with end time prophecy, what you should be able to identify is this story is a parable. And there's coded information in this story that's teaching you something. And the primary thing that it's teaching you is when you read this story and it said run away, and this was verse 27, that verse 27 is identifying the second angel's message in this story. Because the point that we want to see is in story X, we should be able to see the first, second and third steps. But remember I told you yesterday, if you read the Gospels, you're never going to find those 3 steps in the story of Christ. Unless someone shows you the rules on how to look and how to search. You will never be able to do that by just reading the narrative, because we've all been doing it. You've been reading the story of the Gospels for some of us for many decades, for many years, and you've never been able to identify, oh look, there's the first, second and third angel's messages. So Again, in this story, we could see the first, second and third step, but someone needs to identify this to you. And in this story, the way you're going to do this is by seeing in verse 27, it says, run away, and you say, I remember, there's a doubling that's going on here, and the doubling is always connected to the second angel, and so here we have the second angel all sorted out right in that story. And then all you need to do is find the first and the third. So hopefully you can see that principle. In this statement here, she says, repeat the message. Now when we talk about repeating of the message, what angel are we talking about here? We're talking about the third angel, because the repeat or the conclusion is dealing with the third angel. But she's going to connect the third angel to the second, because she says, repeat the message, repeat the message. So we're not going to deal with that issue in our studies at the moment, but we're going to bring this point, it's going to be an important point to understand as we develop this logic through this weekend. There's going to be an interaction between the third angel that's being discussed here and the second angel. So I just want you to put that in the back of your minds. At the moment, all I want you to see is that the repeat of the message is the third, and the message was the first and second. So let's go to the next paragraph, paragraph 3. For years, the pioneers of our work struggled to place the cause of present truth on vantage ground. Skipping down to the next portion that's highlighted. Now, after many years, when the Lord bids us to proclaim the message, what message does He want us to proclaim? The message here, which is the same message that was repeated by the pioneers. The pioneers did this work, and now we're supposed to be doing this work, this repeating of the message, which now looks like the third. Now when the Lord bids us proclaim the message once more with power in the east, shall we not respond? So the message was first given in the east, and now it's to be repeated in the east. Dropping down to the next paragraph, she says, the beginning has been made in proclaiming the third angel's message. She then talks about the cities that it's being done in. And what I want to introduce to you is the idea that in 1909, she says that the third angel's message has already begun to be promulgated or begin to be taught. She says the beginning has already been made. So sometime in this history, they'd already begun the work of the third angel, or the repeating of the message. And what I want to introduce to you is this idea that here's Revelation 18 verse 1, and this is the first angel's message. So we're clear on that. She says the third angel's message here, which was the repeat of the first and second, has already begun. So if the third message here has already begun, it should have looked like the giving or the delivering of the first and the second, should it not? So when she says that it's already begun, she's identifying that the first angel's message has already come into history. And we read an earlier statement from Evangelism 613 that people reject that this message has already come, that it's in the future. But here Ellen White is repeating this point that it's actually already started. Dropping down to the next paragraph. This is paragraph 99.2. It says, again in highlighted, bottom of page 3, the Lord desires us to proclaim the third angel's message with power. So here, now she's going to start introducing this concept when she talks about the giving of the third angel that she spoke about at the beginning of this passage. So the giving of the third, which is a repeat of this message, now she defines it in the sense of the third message with power. You know that the third angel's message came in 1844 and it ran through history. So when she speaks about the message being repeated in this history, she's referring to the repetition of giving the first and second angel's messages in this history. And she defines it as the third message, But now she says it's actually the 3E, or the third message, empowered. So when you see the third angel's message, which is to be empowered, it should look like this history here, because it's a repetition or a repeat or a conclusion of the singular message of Millerite history being fulfilled again the second time. And so that's why we teach, that's what's unique about this message, our focus upon the work of the first and second angels' messages. We're on page 4, and before we read from Manuscript Releases, volume 5, I just want to make one statement. In this time period, people got really concerned about what Ellen White was doing. She was giving support to two men who were nobodies. And people got extremely concerned, because remember I told you yesterday that in 1884, what was happening in the church? There was a subtle attack upon Ellen White's ministry, because Ellen White was quite vocal with her pen. If there were wrongs in the church done by individuals, she would write to those people, and often those letters, those councils of admonition would get published publicly, and people would get humiliated publicly, and there was a backlash against this type of ministry that Ellen White was using in this time period. And he was not the only person. This became a running theme with the leadership.
And then he went as far as to justify her lack of inspiration in regards to commenting on him by saying the Bible also exists.
So when Ellen White is now supporting Wagner and Jones in this message, and the wording that they're using is totally different to the wording that the leadership are using, someone asked her a question, a very poignant question. They said this: "We know that you're claiming to teach the third angel's message. We've just read about it here." And she says yes. So the question they asked was, here's the third angel's message. We, the church, the structure, understand what the third angel's message is. The third angel's message is a message about the Sunday law. Because it says that in Revelation 14, verses 9 to 11. Every Adventist knows that. And that's all good and well, that's all fine. But here's Wagner and Jones, and they're giving another message. They're talking about this abstract concept called justification by faith. And the question that's being asked to Ellen White is, how did these things gel together? What's the connection between these two? And she makes this famous statement that I'm going to just paraphrase. She says this: yes, the third angel's message is justification by faith in verity or in truthfulness. Verity just means truthfulness, in truth. So she says yes, the third angel's message is justification by faith. They're the same thing. And people did not want to hear that, because it sounded like they were two different issues, two different subjects. And they would explain it like this: this was prophecy, and this was the gospel. And what connection has prophecy with the gospel? They're not related subjects, they're totally different. One is talking about things that are going on in the world, and the other one is talking about your personal salvation. So how can you connect these two things together? And that's exactly what Ellen White did. She joined these two things together, and not only joined them together, she said they're the same thing. She says the third angel's message is justification by faith. Now today, in 2016, in the 21st century, there are many people who preach and teach the message of Wagner and Jones, or the 1888 message as it's known about today. Go and see, I'm not recommending you read their material, but if you do, or you're familiar with it, and bring it to your remembrance, what their emphasis is about the third angel's message. And one of the things that I'm certain that you will see that isn't part of their message is this issue about the first and second angel's messages. So one of the things that I want to show you, which I already have here, but it may have escaped you, is that when we talk about the third angel's message equals justification by faith, this is exactly what Brother Patrick taught you yesterday. That when you see this justification by faith, what it should look like, I'm not saying you have to draw it on a line, but it should look like the first and the second angel's messages, because it would be a reform line. And this isn't just something that we've constructed that, it's hard to see. Ellen White says this, that the third angel's message is justification by faith in truth. And we've just defined that the third angel's message is the first and second angel's messages. We just read that in her writings really clearly. So if we're saying the third angel's message is justification by faith, then we know that the first and second angel's messages are also justification by faith in verity. And the first and second angel's messages look like this. First the first, and then the second. And if you draw that out as a line like we've done, in any biblical history or Millerite history, then you can see that the message that we are giving is the only message of justification by faith in the church today. Because nobody speaks about the work of the first and second angels' messages and how they relate to justification by faith, because they've detached or separated the third message from the first and the second in a way that Ellen White never intended that we should do. Let's close with prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness and your mercy. As we see a struggle going on in your church today, Lord, we know that none of us can escape making a decision one way or the other, whether or not we will understand the time in which we live in and the manner in which the message of the third angel is being delivered. Each of us has already entered into probationary time, though we may not even have realized it. Help us to make the right decision, Father, according to your word and not the word of man, is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.